The blade was already at her throat when Orsino Radu walked into the room. Celeste Prescott did not scream. She had stopped screaming approximately 40 seconds into her capture, when she had realized that screaming in the underground court of the vampire lord Vethian Mirescu would only encourage him. Instead, she held herself very still, her medical bag clutched against her chest like armor, her dark eyes tracking every shadow in the vast stone chamber beneath the streets of Bucharest. The blade at her throat was cold, held by a pale-handed vampire guard, whose fingers were perfectly steady. She noted that the blade was iron, not silver. Interesting law divergence. She catalogued it the way she catalogued everything, the way she had survived medical school, emergency rotations, and 3 years of field work in places no sensible doctor traveled alone. Then the doors opened, and the room changed. Every vampire in the chamber went still. The kind of still that prey animals go still, suddenly aware that the apex predator has entered the territory. Celeste felt it before she saw it, a drop in the ambient temperature, a shift in the charged electric quality of the air, and then the measured sound of footsteps on stone. Not hurried, never hurried. The footsteps of someone who had not needed to rush toward anything in several centuries. Orsino Radu was tall in the way that old architecture was tall, built for grandeur rather than mere height, everything about him designed to command space. His hair was white as January ice, swept back from a face that belonged in oil paintings rather than the modern world, all severe angles and carved shadows. His skin was alabaster pale, flawless in the way that no living human skin was ever flawless, and his eyes were the color of dark amber, nearly black in the dim light of the chamber, but catching every candle flame and throwing it back doubled. He wore a dark coat that brushed the floor, and beneath it a deep charcoal suit that would not have been out of place in the most expensive boardroom in Europe. He looked exactly like what he was. He looked like someone who had been ruling since before most nations existed. His gaze swept the room and landed on the blade at Celeste's throat, and something happened in his expression that was so subtle and so dangerous that she felt the guard holding her flinch 3 seconds before Orsino spoke. "Release her," he said, and his voice was low and resonant, and left absolutely no room for interpretation. "My Lord Radu," Vethian Mirescu began, rising from his carved chair at the far end of the chamber, his own white hair coiled elaborately, his court robes dramatic and overdone in the way of someone who had never felt entirely secure in their power. "The human intruded on my court. The blood law is clear. Unauthorized humans who enter vampire territory forfeit their She carries a healer's mark," Orsino said, and his voice was quieter now, which somehow made it worse, "registered with the accord. Touching her is a violation of 4 separate ancient vows your court signed 300 years ago, which I personally witnessed." He did not look at Vethian when he said this. He was looking at the guard holding the blade. "Release her now." The blade disappeared. Celeste exhaled carefully and pressed 2 fingers against her throat to check her pulse. Elevated but controlled. "Fine." Orsino crossed the chamber toward her, and she noticed that the gathered vampires parted for him without conscious thought, the way water parts for stone. He stopped 2 feet from her, which felt close in the sudden silence, and he looked at her the way she imagined surgeons sometimes looked at patients before deciding whether the operation was worth attempting. "You are the field doctor," he said, "not a question." "Dr. Celeste Prescott," she confirmed. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "I was called here by a message from this court, claiming there was a vampire child in medical crisis. I came because that is what I do, and because the accord between our communities guarantees my safe passage on humanitarian calls." She met his eyes without flinching. "Your associate with the blade seems to have missed that particular memo." Something shifted behind those amber eyes. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "You were not passing through," he said, and there was a new quality to his voice now, something that sounded almost like curiosity. "No," she said simply. "I never pass through anything. I came because someone needed help." He was quiet for a moment. Behind him, Vethian Mirescu had begun making sounds of protest that neither of them was paying any attention to. Orsino reached into his coat and produced a card which he held out to her. It was cream-colored, heavy stock, and bore only a crest and an address. "The child is not here," he said. "The message was a trap, though I suspect not the trap Vethian intended." The boy is at my residence, where I moved him 2 days ago when I realized Mirescu's court was no longer a safe environment for vulnerable members. He paused. I apologize for what happened to you in this chamber. That will be addressed. He said the last part without looking at Vithian, but Vithian sat down very quickly anyway. If you are still willing, the boy needs a physician who understands both vampire physiology and human medicine. There are very few of you. Celeste took the card. She looked at the address. She looked at him. Is it actually a medical emergency? She asked. Yes, he said, without hesitation or embellishment. She put the card in her coat pocket.
Then lead the way, Lord Radu.
The look he gave her then was something she would think about later, when she had time to think, which was not for quite a long time. It was the look of someone who had expected argument or fear or negotiation and had encountered none of those things. He led the way. She followed. The child's name was Davin, and he was roughly the vampire equivalent of 10 years old, which meant he had been turned, involuntarily and illegally sometime in the last decade, a tragedy and a crime that the vampire accord addressed with serious consequence. He was small and silent, and his eyes were sunken, and Celeste had her bag open before she had fully crossed the threshold of the room where he lay. The residence Orsino had brought her to was not what she had expected, though she was not entirely sure what she had expected. It occupied the entire top floor of a building that presented as a grand historical hotel from the outside. But the interior had been converted into something that fell between a European manor house and a working court. The ceilings were high, and the walls were stone beneath the plasterwork, and there were books everywhere, thousands of them, lining shelves that ran from floor to ceiling in the corridors, and in every room she caught a glimpse of through open doors. There were also modern medical supplies in Davin's room, already laid out with military precision, and she noted this without comment. You knew someone was coming, she said, pulling on gloves. I hoped, Orsino said. He stood near the door, his arms at his sides, perfectly still, watching her work. It should have been unsettling. It was not. He was watching Davin, not her, with an expression of focused and undisguised concern that was the most human thing she had seen on a vampire's face in 3 years of working the Accord's emergency network. He is dehydrated in a way that should not be physiologically possible for his kind, she said, running her examination, checking pupillary response, checking the quality of the skin at Davin's wrist, listening to the unusual rhythm of his heart with her stethoscope. His turning was incomplete. Yes, Orsino said. That means he has human vulnerabilities that other vampires do not have, but fewer of the enhanced physiological strengths. He is in the worst position of both states. She looked up. Has he been feeding? Insufficiently. Mirescu's court kept him on rations as a means of control. She filed that away for the report she was already composing in her mind for the Accord's oversight board. She turned back to Davin, who was watching her with those sunken eyes, very quiet and very still. Hello, she said to him directly. I am going to help you. My name is Celeste, and I have worked with people in your situation before. You are going to be all right. Davin blinked at her. Then he said, in a voice that was small and careful, You are not afraid of us? No, she said simply. Why not? She thought about it honestly. Because fear makes me a worse doctor, and you need a good doctor. So I decided a long time ago not to be afraid. Davin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Lord Radu is afraid sometimes. He does not show it, but I can tell. She glanced at Orsino without meaning to. He met her eyes with an expression that was utterly unreadable and somehow, beneath the surface of it, not entirely composed. She treated Davin for the next 2 hours. Orsino stayed for all of it, not hovering, not interfering, but present in the steady and reliable way that very few people were present in her experience. When she needed something he did not have, he sent off his people to retrieve it, and the retrieval happened with a speed that suggested his staff either feared him or were devotedly loyal to him, and watching his interactions with them, she began to think it was probably the latter. When Davin finally slept, she stripped off her gloves and stood, stretching the tension from her back. He will recover, she said. He needs consistent feeding from a willing source for the next 3 weeks, monitored by someone who knows what to watch for. His system is confused. It needs guidance. She looked at Orsino. I can come back every other day to monitor his progress if you want. I can write up a treatment protocol. You would do that? he said, and it came out not like a question, but like something he was working out in real time, the logic of it, the meaning of it. It is my job, she said. There is no accord protocol that requires you to make follow-up visits, he said. You fulfilled your obligation the moment you walked in the door. You could leave now and everything would be within the boundary of your duty. She looked at him. Yes, she said, I could. She did not leave. She came back 2 days later, and then 2 days after that, and then the pattern established itself without either of them formally acknowledging it. She arrived at 7 in the evening, which was early enough in the night that Orsino was always already awake and present, and she would spend 2 hours with Davin, and then, because Orsino always had tea ready, and because they were both people who were constitutionally incapable of leaving things unexamined, they would sit in the library and talk. They talked about medicine first, which was safe. She asked him questions about vampire physiology that he answered with the directness of someone who had spent centuries thinking about it from the inside. He asked her questions about modern medical theory that she answered with the same directness, and she noticed that he never asked condescending questions and never filtered his curiosity through the assumption that she would not understand what he was referencing. He spoke to her the way she spoke to colleagues. She found it disarming in a way she had not anticipated. They talked about history next. This was less safe because he was history, and because the things he told her casually, the things he mentioned in passing, were things she had only ever read about in books. He had opinions about the Congress of Vienna that were based on having attended it. He described the texture of certain decades like they were neighborhoods he had lived in. He talked about loss, once very briefly about watching generations of people he had known come and then go, and the way he said it was quiet and matter of fact and somehow more devastating for that. Does it get easier? She asked. No, he said, without any performance of suffering about it. It becomes different. You do not stop seeing them. You simply learn to carry more weight. She thought about that for a long time. The danger came from outside, as it so often did. Not from the things you could see in the room with you, but from the things assembling in the dark beyond the door. Vethian Marescu had not accepted his loss of Davin gracefully. More significantly, he had not accepted the humiliation of Orsino's intervention in his court, which he saw as a violation of sovereignty, regardless of the fact that the ancient vow Orsino had cited was real and documented and unambiguous. Vethian began talking to other courts, pulling old alliances, making the argument that Orsino's protection of a human doctor represented a dangerous precedent, that a king who placed individual human lives above vampire law and blood rights was a king who could not be trusted to hold the old order. It was an argument designed to resonate with the older, more conservative courts, and it resonated. Celeste did not know any of this for the first 3 weeks. She was busy. She was watching Davin's color improve and his responses sharpen and his appetite stabilize. She was writing meticulous reports for the Accord's medical board. She was having conversations in the library that were becoming increasingly difficult to classify as purely professional. She learned that Orsino was approximately 400 years old, give or take a decade, which he acknowledged with the casual imprecision of someone for whom a decade was a rounding error. She learned that he had been born human in what was now Romania, that he had been turned in the political chaos of the 15th century by a vampire whose name he never mentioned and whose motives she gathered had not been honorable. She learned that he had spent the first 50 years of his immortal life being someone she suspected he was not proud of, and that the person he was now was something he had built deliberately, methodically, over long decades, choosing every principle and testing every value against the weight of centuries. You constructed your own honor code, she said one evening, and the way she said it was not criticism but recognition. When the one you were born with is insufficient, he said, and the one you were given by your maker is catastrophic, you build your own. He looked at her across the table. Is that not what you did as well? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I grew up in a medical family. My parents valued credentials over care. I had to choose at some point which part of medicine I believed in. She paused. I chose the care, yes, he said. I noticed. It was the way he said it that did something to her chest. Not flattery, not performance. Just observation, offered as a fact he found significant. She was driving home that night, 3 weeks into her regular visits, when she noticed the car following her. She was not an agent. She was not trained in surveillance. But she had grown up in the modern world, and she had worked in enough unstable environments to have developed a functional instinct for threat. And the black car, 2 lengths behind her, had been 2 lengths behind her since she had left the building, maintaining exactly the distance, whether she sped up or slowed down. She drove to a brightly lit public parking garage instead of going home, parked on the 2nd level near the elevator, and walked quickly to her car with her keys in her fist and her phone already dialing. Orsino picked up before the 2nd ring. "Someone followed me when I left tonight," she said. There was a pause of approximately 1 second. "Are you in public?" he asked. "Yes, parking garage, upper level, well lit, multiple security cameras. Stay there. Do not go to your apartment. I will send Theodoric." He paused again, and when he spoke again, his voice was different. Not louder, tighter. "Celeste, I need you to understand that this is related to my situation and not yours. You are in danger because of proximity to me. I am sorry." "Explain on arrival," she said. "I am fine for now." Theodoric arrived in 11 minutes. He was old even by vampire standards. Quiet and deliberate and wearing reading glasses he did not actually need, but had apparently worn. For so long they had become part of his presentation. He drove her back to the building without speaking, which she appreciated, and she spent the drive cataloguing what she knew and organizing it into something actionable. The library, when she arrived, had more people in it than she had ever seen there. 3 vampires she did not recognize stood near the bookshelves with particular stillness of people who were trying very hard not to be what they were. And Orsino stood at the center of the room, with his hands clasped behind his back, and the expression of someone managing a situation he found deeply offensive on multiple levels. "The full version," she said, setting her bag down. He gave it to her without hesitation, which she noticed and respected. Vithian's coalition, the argument being made against him in the shadow courts. The specific concern that his visible association with a human doctor was being used as political evidence of what his opponents were calling dangerous softness toward the mortal world. "They are going to use me against you," she said. "They are attempting to," he corrected. "There is a distinction. They can attempt many things." "But they followed me home," she said, "which means the next escalation is using me as leverage, either as a hostage or as a bargaining chip to force your hand in the courts." He looked at her with that expression he had, the one where he was revising his assessment of her in real time, and she had the sense that he kept encountering her doing things he had expected to have to explain, and finding they did not require explanation. "Yes," he said. "What are your options?" she asked. He walked to the window. Outside, the city lights of Bucharest lay below them, red and gold and contemporary, a human city that had been built over centuries of human and inhuman history layer by layer. "I could publicly end your association with this court. Remove you from the equation. It would eliminate your immediate danger, but would leave Davin without consistent medical care at a critical stage, and would require me to act as though your safety and your work were not worth protecting, which I am not willing to do." He paused. "I could escalate preemptively in the shadow courts, but that risks open confrontation between cohorts, which is what the ancient vows are specifically designed to prevent, and which would cost lives on multiple sides." Another pause. "Or I could make the argument that Vithian is trying to invert and make it loudly." She turned to look at him. "What argument?" "That the protection of a registered healer operating under the Accord is not softness. It is the foundation of the agreement that allows vampire courts to exist within modern society without the full weight of human institutions descending on us." He turned from the window. "That Vithian's challenge is not about philosophy. It is about power, and specifically about his desire to return to an era of blood law where might was the only currency, and that I have spent 4 centuries refusing to live in that era and will not begin now." The room was very quiet. "That is a good argument," she said. "It is a true argument," he said, "which is generally better." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I am not going anywhere for the record. I will not be used to pressure you, and I will not be evacuated like furniture. Davin needs me for another week at minimum, and beyond that—" She stopped. "Beyond that," he said, and his voice was quiet and careful, the way it was when he was paying very close attention. Beyond that, I will make my own choices about where I am and why, she said. Not based on political convenience and not based on fear. The silence between them was different from the silences she had catalogued before. This one had weight, this one had direction. You are the most remarkable person I have encountered in this century, he said, and it was not flattery and not performance and not calculation. It was just true, stated the way he stated true things, without decoration. She felt it land somewhere that had not been touched in a long time. I am staying, she said, but you should know that is not purely professional anymore, and I think you already know that, so I am saying it out loud so neither of us is pretending. He looked at her with those amber eyes that caught and held light like something precious. I know, he said. 3 days later, the coalition moved. They came not through the front of the building, but through a passage that Celeste had not known existed, an old access corridor running beneath the street from a neighboring property that had once, in a previous century, been connected to this building under different ownership. Vithian's people had done their research. 2 of Orsino's people were taken at their posts before any alarm was raised, and Celeste was in Davin's room when she heard the sound of movement in the corridor that did not match any pattern she had learned to recognize in her weeks in this building. She locked Davin's door. She checked his vital signs, which were distressed but stable. She pulled out her phone. Sino answered on the first ring. East corridor, she said very quietly. 3, maybe 4, moving fast. I am with Davin. We are locked in. Do not open that door for anyone but me, he said, and his voice had that quality she had heard only once before, in the chamber with Vithian, the quality of something very old and very dangerous that was done exercising restraint. I am coming. She pushed a heavy medical cabinet in front of the door, not because it would stop a vampire, and she was not naive enough to think it would, because it would slow them down, because 30 additional seconds might matter. She had learned, in emergency rooms and field hospitals, that you always bought time where you could. Davin sat up in his bed. His eyes were wide and dark and afraid. Come here, she said, and he came to her without hesitation, and she wrapped an arm around him, the way she had seen his posture indicate he needed. Firm and steady, communicating that she was not afraid. She was a little afraid. She did not show it. They heard voices in the corridor. 2 of Vithian's guards tried the door. Then they heard the impact of a body against the wall, and then another, and then a voice she recognized. Stand down, Orsino said, and even through the door and the stone it carried, or I will give you a reason to remember this night for the remainder of your immortal lives. She moved the cabinet. She opened the door. The corridor was a study in controlled violence. 2 of Vithian's guards were on the floor, unhurt but entirely immobilized, held in place by the pressure. Orsino was exerting in a way she could feel but not see, like the air itself had weight and opinion. 2 more stood at a distance, clearly reconsidering their choices. Orsino stood between them and the door, his coat moved by the velocity of what had happened, his expression the one she was learning to read as the face beneath the face, not regal composure but something rawer and more personal. The expression of someone who had found something worth protecting and was not available for conversation about it. He turned when he heard her open the door, and for one single unguarded moment his eyes moved over her with a relief so comprehensive it was almost painful to see. You are unhurt, he said. We are fine, she said. Davin is fine. The relief did not leave his face. He crossed to them and looked at Davin with that expression that had nothing of the king in it and everything of something far simpler and far more urgent, and he put one hand very carefully on the boy's head, the way very powerful people sometimes touch things they are afraid of breaking. Good, he said to Davin. You were brave. She told me not to be scared, Davin said, with complete confidence as though this had resolved the matter entirely. Orsino looked at her. She looked back. The corridor, she said, gesturing. Handled, he said. Theodoric has the perimeter. There are more of my people coming. He paused. This ends tonight. The coalition has made a choice by entering my residence and threatening my ward and my... He stopped. She waited. My physician, he said, and the pause before it had been exactly long enough to make the word feel like it was standing in for another one. Your physician is unimpressed with the coalition, she said crisply, and would like to be part of the conversation about how this ends, because I have a professional stake in the resolution. He almost smiled then, almost. Of course you would. What happened next took 2 more days, and it was political in a way that was difficult to make linear, but Celeste was good at non-linear systems, and she paid attention to all of it. Orsino summoned the shadow courts, not requested. Summoned, which was a distinction with significant historical and political weight, apparently, because it meant he was invoking his authority as king, which he had apparently been sufficiently circumspect about exercising that the invocation itself carried the quality of a statement. The courts came, or sent representatives, because the alternative was a very pointed insult to someone who had just demonstrated, in the east corridor of his residence, that his restraint was a preference and not a limitation. Celeste was there. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for anything, thoroughly, specifically, and without the expectation that anyone was going to make it easy for her. She presented to the Shadow Court as a registered healer under the Accord, representing both the medical board and her own direct account. She described what had happened in Vethian's court 3 weeks ago with the precision of a clinical report, including the blade, the threat, and the violation of 4 ancient vows. She described Davin's condition and the systematic neglect that had created it. She described the attack on Orsino's residence as what it was: an attempt to use a protected humanitarian worker as leverage in an internal power dispute, which was a violation of the Accord, significant enough to require formal consequence. She spoke for 23 minutes, standing in a room full of vampires who were several centuries older than her, and she did not soften a single sentence. When she finished, the silence in the room had a very specific texture. She had spoken in emergency rooms where she was the youngest doctor and the least credentialed and the most right, and she recognized this silence. It was the silence of people encountering an argument they could not immediately refute. Orsino spoke after her, and where her presentation had been clinical, his was architectural, building the case stone by stone: the blood law, the ancient vow, the political precedent, the historical record, and the specific and documented pattern of Vethian's behavior across decades. He was not angry in the way she had seen him angry, not the controlled burn of the corridor. He was cold and precise and entirely devastating, and she understood, watching him, how someone could lead something for 4 centuries. Not through force, through the absolute certainty of someone who had done the math. Vethian Mirescu was formally censured by the Shadow Court. His political coalitions dissolved in the way that coalitions dissolved when the central argument turned out to have been built on a lie, which was not all at once but cascade, quickly and then entirely. His claim over Davin was nullified under the terms of the Accord's protections for involuntarily turned juveniles. 2 of his allies who had participated in the attack on the residence chose to relocate to courts in other cities, rather than face the specific scrutiny that Orsino's attention would now involve. Vethian himself met with Orsino privately, which Celeste was not present for, and she did not ask what was said. She understood that there were things that happened between people who had been in power for a long time that did not translate to clinical documentation, and she trusted the outcome, which was that Vethian withdrew his challenges and his claims and retreated to his court without further action. She asked Orsino afterward, sitting in the library with the fire going and the city lights below. "What did you say to him?" I reminded him, Orsino said, turning his glass slowly in his hand. "That the reason the Accord exists is because 40 years ago, 3 European vampire courts came close enough to open exposure that human governments had begun gathering specific evidence. The Accord prevented a war that would have been catastrophic for everyone. Vethian was there. He signed the document. He set the glass down. I reminded him that everything he has, his court, his standing, his authority, exists within a framework that requires the cooperation of people like Celeste Prescott. That the contempt he showed for her safety was contempt for the thing that protects him." "Did it work?" she asked. "He understood," Orsino said. "Whether he agreed is a different question. But understanding was sufficient." She nodded. Then she said, "And Davin?" "Davin stays," he said simply. "He is part of this household. He was before this, but now it is formal." He paused. "I should have formalized it sooner. Sometimes I am slow to name things I am already doing." She looked at him. The fire was behind her, and the amber in his eyes was lit deep, and the room was very quiet in the way it was only late at night when the city settled into itself, and the building breathed round them like a living thing. "Are you slow to name all things?" she asked, and her voice was careful, the way his voice was careful when he was paying close attention. He looked at her for a moment that stretched and held. "With most things, yes," he said. "With you, I find I have less patience for my own caution than usual." Her heart did something that she noted with the clinical part of her mind, and the rest of her mind overrode immediately. "Then name it," she said. He set his glass aside and he turned to fully face her, which with him was a significant thing. The way he moved in space, always deliberate, always chosen. His eyes held hers with that amber steadiness she had come to recognize as the thing beneath all the political composure and the regal distance. "I have been watching you walk into rooms that frightened you and not show it for weeks," he said. "I have watched you refuse to be anything less than exactly yourself in circumstances designed to diminish you. I have watched you speak to a child who needed gentleness with the same instinct you speak to shadow courts that need precision, because you understand what each situation requires and you give it without calculation." He paused. "I have not met many people who do not require anything from me, Celeste, who are not here because of what I am or what I can provide. You came for Davin, you stayed because you chose to, and every time you stay, I am." He stopped. "You are," she said quietly. "Grateful," he said, in a way that word has not been adequate for a long time, and something beyond grateful. "Something I have been very careful about naming, because I am 400 years old, and I have learned that the things you name out loud become real, and real things can be lost." She stood up. She crossed the small distance between them, and stood in front of him the way she stood in front of difficult situations, directly and without flinching. "I know about loss," she said. "I am a physician. I know the exact weight of it. And I know the difference between something worth the risk of loss and something you protect yourself from at the cost of never having it." He looked at her face. "I have been alive for 4 centuries, he said very quietly. "You have been alive for 31 years, and in 31 years you have understood something about living that I spent 300 years missing." She reached up and put her hand against his face, the way she had put her hand on Davin's forehead that first night. The way she touched things she was choosing to be responsible for. He closed his eyes, which was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen him do. "I am not passing through," she said softly. I have not been passing through since the second visit, you should know that." He opened his eyes, and she was still looking at him, direct and clear and certain, and he lifted one hand and covered hers where it rested against his face, his cool fingers wrapping around hers, with a care that was enormous in its restraint. "Then stay," he said, and it was the simplest thing she had ever heard him say. "I intend to," she said. He kissed her the way she might have guessed he would do things, with complete attention and no hurry, and an intensity that was not demanding, but that was profoundly, entirely present. And she thought, with the small clinical corner of her mind that was always running in the background, that this was what 400 years of paying attention felt like. And then the clinical corner went quiet for once, and she stopped thinking about it at all. Davin's recovery became complete at the end of the 4th week, which Celeste documented with the thoroughness she brought to all her records and filed with the Accord's medical board, with a recommendation that his case be used as a clinical baseline for future incomplete turning interventions. The board responded with a letter that was enthusiastic in the measured way of medical boards and with a request that she consider joining a formal advisory panel on vampire-human medical collaboration. She discussed it with Orsino over dinner, which had become a feature of her evenings in the building, dinner together before her visits with Davin, and then the library afterward, and then the quiet negotiation of 2 people choosing each other on an ongoing basis. The small decisions that accumulated into something definitive. It would mean more travel, she said, laying the letter on the table. Vienna, Edinburgh, Prague. The shadow courts in those cities have the worst relationships with human medicine. They have the highest rates of medical crisis going unaddressed because their members will not approach human facilities and there are not enough Accord-registered healers. Yes, he said. He was reading the letter. He read quickly, which she had noticed, and processed in the way that people who had read a very great many things processed, without having to work at the words themselves, because The capacity was absolute. "You have court obligations that keep you in Bucharest most of the time," she said. He looked up. "You are asking whether this creates a conflict." "I am being transparent about the parameters," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The courts in Vienna and Edinburgh and Prague have long-standing relationships with my court. My presence in cities, even intermittently, would be politically useful." He paused. "And I have been spending more time at a desk than is good for anyone's sense of proportion. Theodoric manages the day-to-day administration better than I do." She looked at him steadily. "You would travel with me, if you would permit it." "Permit," she repeated, and there was something in her voice that made him put the letter down and look at her fully. "What I mean," he said, "is that I do not want to make decisions about your work for you or around you. You were doing your work very well before I existed in your life, and you will continue to do it. I am not offering to run your practice. I am offering to be somewhere near where you are, if that is useful, and to protect you when protection is relevant, and to be—" He stopped, and there was a flicker of something on his face that she had learned to read as him running out of precedent for what he was trying to say. "To be there," she said gently. "Yes," he said, "to be there." "Then yes," she said, "come with me." The months that followed were the kind of months that she had always thought of as impossible. Not because they were without difficulty, but because they were so consistently and fundamentally real. They traveled and they worked, and they argued occasionally about methodology, and about risk, and about the appropriate amount of caution to apply to a given situation, and they were always both right in different ways, and they always reached the same conclusion eventually, which was that the other person's perspective had improved the outcome. She saw him in Vienna navigate a political dispute between three ancient courts that had been nursing a grievance for 160 years, with a patience and a precision that left her quietly astonished. And he told her afterward that her clinical approach to disagreement, the tendency to treat conflict as a problem requiring diagnosis rather than a battle requiring victory, had changed how he thought about those conversations. She met the Edinburgh court, which was older than the Romanian courts by at least 2 centuries and considerably more conservative, and the court's senior elder, a vampire named Ilaris who had been alive since something she preferred not to calculate, told her flatly that Orsino Radu was not someone who brought humans to court meetings, and that her presence was an irregularity. "Then I will treat it as a new protocol," Celeste said pleasantly, and pulled out her documentation on the Edinburgh Court's medical need assessments, which she had prepared in advance, and Ilaris had looked at the documentation in silence and then said, with the particular quality of very old people encountering something that genuinely surprised them, "You did this on your own initiative?" "Yes," she said, "before meeting us." "Research improves outcomes," she said. Ilaris had looked at her for a long time, then she had looked at Orsino. Then she had said, in a tone that contained 3 centuries of political acuity, and something that might, from the right angle, have been approval, bring her to the formal session. Orsino had not smiled, because Orsino almost never smiled all the way, but that the quality of his expression in that moment was something she held on to. They had been working together, traveling together, building something together that was entirely their own, for 8 months when she came back from a late consultation in Prague, to find him in the library, with 2 letters on the table, one old and one very new, and a stillness about him that was the specific stillness of someone waiting for an event they had been anticipating with mixed emotion. She sat across from him. "Tell me," she said. "The old letter is from the Accord's founding council," he said. "It was written 40 years ago, during the negotiations I mentioned to Vithian. It is a clause in the primary document that I drafted and that all courts signed. It concerns Hugh Martners of Vampire Court members." She looked at the letters. "And the new one?" "The new one is from the Accord's review board," he said, "responding to a query I sent 8 months ago." He paused. "Shortly after you told me you were not passing through." She looked up at him. "The clause I drafted 40 years ago," he said, "was designed for a theoretical scenario. I did not draft it for personal reasons at the time, because I had no personal reasons at the time." He paused again, and she recognized this pause now, the one where he was choosing words with the same care he chose everything. The clause establishes formal protections for human partners who choose to remain in sustained relationship with vampire court members. Political protections, physical protections, and, if the human in question chooses it, the option of inclusion in the vampire lifespan through a fully consented and fully completed transformation performed under medical supervision, without duress, at a time of the human's own choosing. The room was very still. "You wrote the legal framework," she said slowly, "for a situation you did not yet know you would be in." "I wrote it because I believed it was right," he said. "Because I have always believed that love, when it occurred between our kinds, deserved protection rather than prohibition." He met her eyes. "I did not know I would one day need it." She was quiet for a moment, processing this the way she processed clinical information, not rushing, allowing the full shape of it to become clear before responding. "The clause does not require a decision now," he said. "It does not require a decision ever, if that is not what you want. You have every protection within the accord as a registered healer regardless. I am not." He stopped. "I am not raising this as pressure. I am raising it because you have a right to know what is possible, and because I believe in being transparent about the parameters." She almost smiled at him, returning her own phrase to her. "I am 31 years old," she said. "Yes," he said, "you are 400, approximately." "The math is not comfortable," she said. "No," he agreed. "But the math was never the question," she said. She looked at the letters on the table. She looked at him. "I am a physician. I have spent my entire adult life extending time for people who needed more of it. I believe in time. I believe in more time." She paused. "I also believe in doing things because you mean them and not because fear compels you. I would not make a choice like that from fear of losing what we have. I would make it from wanting to see more." "Of what?" he asked softly. "Of everything," she said. "Of this work, of these conversations. Of whatever argument we are going to have next, and what conclusion we will reach together." She looked at him steadily. "Of you?" He looked at her with those amber eyes, and for the second time, in her experience of him, he let her see all of it. The relief and the longing and the quality of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had, without quite noticing the moment it happened, found that someone else was helping carry it. "Not now," she said. "I am not ready now. But I want you to know that it is not a closed question. I want you to know that when I think about the future, you are in it, fully, for a long time." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The way he had the first time, in the library, with the same comprehensive care, and she felt the cool solidity of him, and thought that he was the most steady thing she had encountered in 31 years, of finding her own footing in a world that had not always made it easy. "A long time," he said, and the way he said it held 4 centuries of knowing what that meant. "At minimum," she said, "the formal resolution of the political situation with the coalition was completed 6 months later, when Vethian Mărescu formally petitioned to rejoin the broader accord framework under Orsino's oversight, which was a capitulation that carried more weight for being done publicly and on the record. Orsino accepted it without ceremony, which was, Celeste thought, more powerful than any formal display would have been. Davin, by this time, had grown into himself in the way that young people grew, not all at once, but accumulating. He had started studying, which Orsino encouraged with the focused intensity he brought to things he cared about. And he had developed a particular interest in history, which, given the resources available to him in the library, was an excellent interest to have. He came to Celeste with questions sometimes, medical questions and other questions, and she answered all of them with the same directness she had used from the first night, because she had learned that directness was what he needed. He asked her once, sitting in the kitchen while she was making tea, whether it was strange to love someone who was not going to die. She thought about it honestly. "It is stranger to think about than to live," she said. "In the living of it, it is just being with someone who is exactly who they are." "Are you going to stay forever?" he asked. "I am going to stay for a very long time," she said. "What forever looks like, I will figure out as I go." She poured his tea and slid it across the table. "That is what everyone does, you know, vampire or human. Everyone is figuring out the next part as they go." Davin considered this. "Lord Radu does not seem like he is figuring anything out," he said. "He seems like he always knows." She thought of the night in the library with the 2 letters, and the careful, deliberate way Orsino had said the word permitted, and the unguarded quality of his eyes in the firelight. "He is figuring things out," she said. "He is just very good at making it look intentional." Davin grinned at her, and she thought that the grin, which was entirely unself-conscious and entirely young, was one of the better things she had seen in this building. When she told Orsino what Davin had said later, he was quiet for a moment and then said, with a quality she had learned to identify as the thing he did instead of laughing, "He is perceptive." "He is," she said. "You should tell him." "Tell him what?" "That he is perceptive. People should be told the things they do well. It does not happen enough." He looked at her. "You do that," he said, consistently. "With everyone. It is efficient," she said. "People perform better when they know what they are good at. It is basic management theory. It is kindness," he said simply. She shrugged. That, too, he did tell Davin the following evening, which she knew because Davin came to find her afterward with a carefully contained expression of someone who had just received something they were not sure how to hold without breaking, and she quietly handed him a book from the library shelf and said nothing about it, because sometimes the right response to something important was to give someone space to have it. The year turned and then turned again. She filed more accord reports. She trained 2 new physicians in the specialized field she had been developing, a formal methodology for human-vampire medical collaboration that was now being called the Prescott Protocol in the literature, which she found both gratifying and faintly embarrassing. She and Orsino had their argument about Prague's water quality in the old court district, and she won, which she suspected he had allowed, but which she chose to take at face value. They traveled to Istanbul, where the oldest court in the European network had been watching her work from a diplomatic distance, and finally, through a chain of courteous correspondence, requested a consultation. She stood in the Istanbul court's vast and ancient chamber, which made Vethian's hall look like a waiting room, and presented her methodology to a gathered group of vampires whose collective ages she estimated, conservatively, at somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 years of accumulated existence, and she was aware throughout that Orsino was standing to her right at precisely the angle that put him between her and the room's primary entrance, which was something he did without appearing to do it. A habit so deeply embedded, she sometimes thought he was not conscious of it. She had decided, going to consider it a compliment and not say anything about it, because there were certain conversations she had chosen not to have. For the same reason she chose not to argue with a particularly solid bridge about its own architecture. It was what it was. She was comfortable with it. After the Istanbul consultation, which went excellently, and resulted in a formal medical partnership agreement between 3 ancient courts and the Accord, they walked along the waterfront at night, and the city lay around them, old and layered and magnificent, and she thought about how many ways there were to exist in a world, and how different this existence was from what she had imagined for herself at 22 in her first year of medical school, and how much better it was than anything she had imagined. "You are thinking very loudly," Orsino said beside her. "Occupational hazard," she said. "What specifically?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I am thinking about the Accord's Istanbul agreement and whether the follow-up schedule I proposed is realistic given travel times." A pause. "And I am thinking that this is a very good city to walk through at night." Another pause. "And I am thinking about the clause." He was quiet. The water moved below the railing, dark and salt-scented. "I have been thinking about it for 8 months, she said. "Which is, I note, the same amount of time you have been waiting without saying anything about it, for which I will give you significant credit." "I told you," he said, "no pressure. Your timeline." "My timeline," she said, "is telling me that I am ready." She turned to look at him. "Not because I am afraid of losing time, not from fear, because I want to be here for the rest of what this is. Because I have been building a life for the last 2 years that has meaning in it and people in it that I choose and work that matters, and I want to continue building it, and I want to build it with you, and I want to have enough time to build something genuinely worth having." He looked at her for a long moment. The city lights were behind her, and the water caught and scattered them, and she could see in his expression the full weight of what he was hearing The comprehensiveness of it, the deliberateness of it. "You are certain," he said. "I am a physician," she said. "I do not make decisions I am not certain about. It is not in my nature." "I know," he said. "I was asking because you deserve to be asked, not because I doubt you." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "That is part of why I am certain." He reached out and took her hand. Standing at the waterfront in Istanbul, with the oldest city in their known world wrapped around them, and he held it with the same comprehensive care he always did, cool and firm and completely present. "Then I will make the arrangements," he said. "Medical supervision, as the clause specifies. Nothing rushed. Nothing without your full participation in every decision. I would supervise it myself if the ethics board would allow it," she said. "They will not," he said, with that adjacent to a smile quality. "I know, I checked." She squeezed his hand. "I am not worried. I trust the process I designed." He looked at something in her face, and whatever he saw there did something to his expression that was, she thought, the most complete version of it she had ever encountered. All the guardedness fully down, all the careful composition set aside, just the thing itself in his amber eyes. "I have loved you," he said. "Since the night you locked a door against things that could walk through walls, to give 30 extra seconds to a child who needed you. Not because it was effective, because it was what you did when you were afraid." She felt the truth of this in the specific place that true things landed. "I have loved you," she said, "since you corrected Vethian Marescu by citing a chapter and verse of a document he had signed in front of you 300 years ago, and did it quietly because you did not need to be loud about it." She paused. "I thought, that is a person who has earned what he is, and I did not think it would become my business, and then it did." "I am glad it did," he said. "So am I," she said. The transformation was performed 4 weeks later under the conditions she had designed and the supervision of the senior medical officer of the Accord in the residence in Bucharest, with Theodoric present and Davin very firmly on the other side of a door that was not locked, because she had specifically said he did not need to be locked out, that this was not a thing that required secrecy within the household. She was not afraid. She had told herself she would not be, and she was not. She was the kind of present she was in operating rooms, precise and focused and committed to the outcome. Orsino held her hand throughout. His expression was the unguarded one. It did not change. The first thing she noticed afterward was the light. Not its absence, which was something she had already begun adjusting for. The quality of it, the way it rendered. She noticed Orsino's face in extraordinary detail, every line of him, every particular of a face she had already memorized, and that now she saw as though from a new depth. "Hello," he said. "Hello," she said. She sat up, which she did with a care that was habitual, and discovered quickly that was no longer entirely necessary. Theodoric was making note at the far end of the room. Davin was not in the room, but she could hear him in the corridor, the specific rhythm of someone trying very hard to stand still. "Davin," she said, and her voice was different. She noticed, richer and steadier, and from the corridor came a sound of movement, and the door opened and he was there, looking at her with enormous eyes. "You look the same," he said after a moment, with what sounded like mild relief. "I look slightly the same," she corrected. "I feel notably different," she considered. "Better. More anchored. As though I was always slightly at a wrong angle to the world, and someone has now corrected the calibration." Orsino made a sound that was, she was almost entirely certain, the closest thing she had ever heard him produce to actual laughter. She looked at him. "Accurate? Entirely," he said. She filed her own report to the Accord's medical board because of course she did, documenting the procedure and her subjective experience of it, with the detail that the Prescott protocol required for all supervised transformations. The board wrote back that it was the most thorough first-person post-transformation account they had received, and that they intended to publish it as a clinical reference document. She wrote back that they had her full permission, provided they used her complete name and her correct title, which was doctor. The world settled around them in the way that worlds settled when the urgent things had been resolved, and what remained was the actual living of the life. Vethian's court remained quiet. The Istanbul Agreement produced its first successful medical interventions within 3 months. Davin began a formal course of study that would have been, in another era, equivalent to university, and took to it with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting for the opportunity without knowing they were waiting. Celeste continued her work, which looked different now and felt different. The same commitment and the same methodology, but with a new duration behind it, the knowledge that the protocols she was building would have time to be refined and expanded and tested and refined again, that she was not working against a clock in the way she had been, that the thing she was building was genuinely terms. She and Orsino argued about the Prague water quality again, and she won again, and this time she was more certain he was not allowing it. They travelled to Edinburgh for the seasonal court review, and Ilaris received them with the particular warmth of very old people who had decided they approved of something, which involved almost no visible warmth at all, and could only be read by context. One evening in the library, which was still the room that felt most like theirs, she was reading and he was working through correspondence, and the fire was going, and the city was doing what cities did outside the windows, and she looked up and found him looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was thinking that this is what I wanted and did not have a name for several centuries." She considered that. "A person to sit in the room with," she said. "A person who was completely themselves, next to whom I could also be completely myself, without the political performance or the institutional weight of it." He paused. "I did not know that was what I was missing because I had never experienced it. I am told that is a common failure of imagination." "It is," she said. "People are generally not good at wanting things they have never had." "You were," he said. She thought about that. "I wanted a kind of medicine that I had not yet seen practiced," she said. "But I had seen the shape of it. I knew what good care felt like, because I had experienced the absence of it, so I knew what to want." He was quiet, thinking about this. "Then you are saying wanting the right thing requires knowing the wrong thing first." "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes it just requires paying attention." He looked at her steadily. "You have always paid attention." "So have you," she said. "You paid attention for 4 centuries and built an entire ethical framework from what you observed. That is paying attention." "It is also," he said, "extremely slow." She smiled at him, fully, the way she had learned to do without managing it. "You have time to make up," she said. He crossed the room, which he did, with the deliberateness she had come to love, every movement chosen, nothing careless. And he sat beside her, and she leaned against the solid, cool, steady fact of him, and the fire went on burning, and the city went on outside, and the library surrounded them with its thousands of accumulated years of words, and the night went on, in the way that good nights went on, without hurry and without ending. "We have time," he said quietly, correcting her tense, and she understood what he meant, and she felt the truth of it, the simple and comprehensive truth of it. "We do," she said. The story of Orsino Radu and Celeste Prescott was not the story either of them had written for themselves. His had been a story of ancient vows and court politics, and the long isolated work of building integrity in a world that had not always made it easy. Hers had been a story of emergency rooms and field hospitals, and choosing care over credential, carrying her competence like a lamp through every dark place she walked. But this was the thing about the stories people actually ended up living. They were never the ones they had originally planned. They were better. They were the product of showing up consistently, in rooms where you were needed, and paying attention, and refusing to look away from difficult things, and choosing, over and over, the people and the work and the principles that made the living of a life something worth doing for a very long time. She had come to Bucharest to treat a child she had never met, on the instruction of an accord protocol she believed in. With no intention of staying, she had stayed. He had thought she was passing through, the way humans always pass through, briefly and brightly, and then gone, the way everything human had always been gone eventually. She was not gone. She was in the library, reading by the fire, in the city that had become her city as much as it was his. In the life they had built together out of competence and honesty and danger survived, and trust earned slowly, and love named out loud on a waterfront at night. And she was going to be there tomorrow, and the month after, and the decade after. And the thought of it, the long and luminous fact of it, was enough to make Orsino Radu ancient and regal, and 4 centuries carefully constructed. Rest his hand gently over hers and feel, for the first time in a very long time, that 400 years had been exactly the right amount of time to wait.